Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana has the grim task of keeping government spending in check while the country continues to battle slow economic growth, rising unemployment and soaring public debt levels and high debt costs. Various sectors of government and society will be looking to the Finance Minister to prioritise their needs as he walks a fine line. Godongwana will deliver his speech at 2 p.m. And so for the next 2 hours, we will be building up to that moment with stories from our reporters across the country with live crossings, and also to SABC News anchor Nompumelelo Siziba, who's in Cape Town. Nompu, you've been speaking to a number of economists throughout the morning. Who do you have now?
Thanks very much, Diabo. Well, you know, the first thing I must talk about before economics is the weather. Earlier today, I was telling our colleagues sitting in your seat that it was so windy. You know, I was being blown out of proportion. And now it's so sunny. It's so hot. It's really amazing, the weather that we're experiencing. And I wonder whether our midterm budget will be varied in that way as well. But I do have with me Deborah Tickle. She's an independent tax expert, and she has spoken to us before, and Andrew Donaldson, he's a research associate at the School of Economics at UCT, just to give us their expectations around what will come out of the MTBPS. Thank you so much for joining us, both of you. Ladies first. Deborah, what is it that you expect to come out from the midterm budget that is particularly of interest to you?
Okay, well, as you know, there's no tax changes ever made in the midterm budget, but the way the format normally goes is that the minister will issue the bills, which we're, as tax people, very excited about because we've all given comment, which is a great thing we have in South Africa, that we're allowed to comment. And then I think he'll give an update on the economy, which is, fortunately for him, looking quite good, although there are a number of negatives, and we can talk about that just now. And then there are obviously, what are the tax collections looking like, because how's it all going to be funded?
So, Andrew, what about the balancing act? Because, of course, you know, the coffers are only, you know, you have so much finite resources, and there are lots of issues pulling on the fiscus, you know, on the social side. Then there's the infrastructure side. There's servicing the debt side. So how does the minister get that right over the medium term? Are they doing enough in terms of structural reforms to actually get the economy growing?
Well, I mean, the first thing we have to say is the minister's in a very, very tough position here. I mean, the economy's not growing, so revenue's not rising much, and so there's very little room for manoeuvre. But it's also an interesting budget statement now because we have a new government, and there was a budget in February that included a 3-year framework, so projections for the next 2 years. And of course, a new government might change that. And so that's an interesting thing to watch this afternoon. He's obviously under pressure from colleagues in the cabinet who all are now, to a greater extent than before, in a sense, competing with each other to perform and deliver. That means more money, but there's no money where it's going to come from. It's not just a political problem for the new government. There's also a protest outside Parliament right now about the pressures on social spending. We know that the budget the forward projections don't have enough for education and health to keep the personnel numbers growing. We've got a big crime problem. So there are really tough choices that have had to be made here. And the big question is this new administration going to change the projections that were tabled in February or not? I don't think anybody expects big changes. And that means that it's another tough budget. And so the growth question is fundamental. We need to hear what the government's plans are for growth. It's not going to come from more spending, but it's certainly got to come from in infrastructure investment and the kinds of incentives that expand business investment and employment creation. Without that kind of assurance that there's a positive outlook for the economy, it's going to be another tough budget.
Andrew paints quite an imperfect picture. So what then is the answer? What would you hope to hear in terms of solutions to the problems he outlines?
Well, when you say solutions, I'm not the one to be asking, but I think the positives are that even Kusatu is now singing off the growth hymn sheet. We saw that John Steenhuisen yesterday was talking to investors and saying we're going to get 3% growth. The Reserve Bank, I was at a talk last week, was talking 1.2% for this year, 1.8% for 2026. Now that's not good enough because we've got huge unemployment. But obviously then the question is, what about the taxes? Because we need to fund all of this. I don't know whether you want me to talk about that now or, okay. So I think the thing to remember with the taxes is that the personal income tax funds 40% of the entire tax take, which is a big amount. Presumably that's based on the fact that we're a consumer-driven economy. 60% of our GDP is driven by the consumers. But the increase from last year was 90 billion rand, which was a huge increase. What we have to remember is that the number of people who are actually paying that tax is very small. So it's actually 1.8 million paying 80%. That's 1% of the population. So then we go back to the Commissioner Kieswetter's comments in the last couple of weeks, which maybe he's overflated the tax gap, because I find it hard to believe that of 1.8 trillion amount of tax collected or budgeted for this year, there's going to be 800 billion, a third basically, that's a tax gap. I just find that a little bit astounding. So maybe it's a little bit overflated, but what he's basically saying is there's a lot more activity in the economy that's not being tapped on. And if we could access that activity, then, or from a tax perspective, then there'd be a lot more money available to spend on what we need to do from an infrastructure and growth perspective.
Andrew, one last thing. I get the feeling that there's going to be a lot of emphasis because, like you say, growth really is the most important thing, because I think, as Deborah has outlined, it's very difficult to really tax anymore. So we need the growth. But when it comes to the strategy for growth, public-private partnerships, that seems to be the buzzword that's going around, and an expectation that we're going to hear more from the Finance Minister in that regard.
Well, let me first say I agree completely with Deborah that the Commissioner's 800 billion number was a huge overestimate. The tax gap is nowhere near that. We actually do quite well by international comparison in the collection of taxes given the size of the economy. And so I don't think there's scope for raising tax rates. I think there might be some scope for collecting more through better administration. But the real action is going to be the kinds of incentives that encourage business investment. And infrastructure investment by the public sector is also a big part of our growth story. But that's not going to come from the tax base. It's got to come from investing in the kinds of things that generate revenue. So the water systems, the electricity transmission lines that generate revenue over time, the freight rail reinvestment that Transnet has to do now, it's going to have to attract private finance, and in attracting private finance, it's going to have to be presented as a credible story about cost recovery from users, from the users of the freight rail service, from citizens who use water and electricity services, and from businesses that pay for those services. So cost recovery is actually the sort of underlying story about financing and being able to afford the kind of investment we need.
Thanks very much. That was Andrew Donaldson there, and Deborah Tickle speaking to us about the challenges that the Finance Minister faces as he tries to, juggle the balls to get the medium-term budget just right, really emphasising on the importance of growth and investment, hoping to rope in the private sector in order to be able to fulfil some of the aims, especially in the areas of electricity transmission and obviously other services that are crucial and important. Transnet being a very important role player, having difficulties at the moment. Some have raised caution that perhaps the government's budget could be disturbed by a need to bail Transnet out if it can't manage on its own.